Stirling Highway runs through Claremont with a kind of ordinary steadiness, past shop fronts and hotel windows and side streets where the trees lean over the curb, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when the traffic thins and the night air from the river settles lightly on the western suburbs of Perth, even a busy road can seem almost still. You can imagine standing there with an old file open in your hands, not in a hurry, not searching for shock or spectacle, but simply noticing the names that appear again and again, the street corners, the hotel doors, the taxi ranks, the times written down by tired officers, and the small statements given by people who were only trying to remember what they had seen on an ordinary night many years before. Claremont in the middle 1990s was not a place people expected to become shorthand for fear, or for patience, or for one of the longest investigations Western Australia had ever known, and yet the case that began there would sit in boxes and binders and forensic freezers for more than 20 years before its answer finally took shape. The first name in the quiet order of the file is Sarah Spears, who was 18 years old when she disappeared in the early hours of the 27th of January, 1996, after a night out in Claremont, and even now her name carries a special ache because she has never been found. She had been with friends, as young people often are on warm weekend nights, moving between places that felt familiar, making small decisions that seemed unimportant at the time, and then, in the hour when one day gives way to the next, she made a phone call for a taxi from a public phone box near Stirling Highway. That detail, the phone call, is one of those small fixed points that investigators return to because it can be placed on a line of time. And when you sit with the case file long enough, you begin to understand how important such fixed points become when so much else is uncertain. The call was logged, the place was known, and the minutes around it could be studied, compared, and returned to again. Though the simple fact remained that Sarah did not arrive home, and the absence she left behind widened slowly into a search that would not end. In the first days, there would have been the familiar movement of a missing person inquiry, the checking of friends and family, the tracing of movements, the hope that some ordinary explanation would appear. And there is a particular kind of patience in those early hours, because investigators are working against time while still trying not to assume too much. They asked questions, followed possible sightings, spoke to taxi drivers and people who had been in the area, and held on to whatever could be measured. Because when someone vanishes between one known point and the next, the distance can feel very small on a map and almost impossible in the mind. You, reading through it years later, might pause over the map of Claremont itself, with Bayview Terrace, Stirling Highway, the hotels, the stations, the places where people gathered, and you might notice how ordinary the geography appears before a case changes it. A footpath is still only a footpath, and a phone box is still only a phone box. But once a name is attached to them, they hold a different kind of memory, not dramatic, not loud, simply present, in the way old paper remains present when it has been handled by many hands. Sarah's disappearance was taken seriously, and within a short time the major crime squad was involved, but the tools available in 1996 were not the tools that would later help solve the case, because forensic science, databases, and the ways police could compare tiny traces were still moving toward what they would become. Investigators had witness statements, timelines, vehicle descriptions, and the slow arithmetic of elimination, and they had the practical work of asking who was nearby, who had driven through, who had spoken to a young woman near Claremont in the small hours of the morning. They also had to live with the uncertainty that settles over a missing person case, when the first searches do not bring an answer, and when each day that passes makes the beginning feel farther away, though never less important. That is one of the gentler lessons inside a cold case file, if anything in such a file can be called gentle, because the work is not only the pursuit of one clear clue, but the refusal to let uncertainty become neglect. Months passed, and the city continued in the way cities do, with morning trains and evening lights, with young people still going out, with families still expecting the people they loved to come home, and somewhere in the background, Sarah's name remained with the officers who had taken the first reports. Then, in June of that same year, another young woman disappeared from the same general area, and the case that had already unsettled Perth became something larger and harder to explain, though the people working it still had to move carefully, detail by detail. without leaping farther than the evidence allowed. Jane Rimmer was 23, a child care worker remembered by those who loved her as warm and lively, and she was last seen in Claremont in the early hours of the 9th of June, 1996, after spending the evening with friends. There was security camera footage, faint and ordinary in the way old surveillance recordings often are, and there were people who had seen her, or thought they had, near the Continental Hotel, which became one of the places investigators would return to again and again in witness statements and reconstructions. The footage did not solve the case, but it gave investigators something to study, a few moments of movement preserved by a machine that had no idea it was recording part of a mystery, and in cold case work, even imperfect images can become quiet companions to memory. Jane's body was found weeks later in bushland south of Perth, and the file changed again, not because anyone stopped caring about Ciara, but because the pattern investigators feared now had a second clear shape, and the work began to gather around the possibility that the two cases were connected. It is worth saying this softly, because these were not symbols, not headlines, not pieces of a puzzle for strangers to arrange at a distance, but young women with families, friends, habits, futures, and ordinary belongings that were left behind in rooms where people still expected to hear their voices. A patient investigation has to hold both truths at the same time, the human truth and the evidentiary truth, because a case can only move through courts on facts, yet the reason anyone keeps searching is that facts are attached to living people. After Jane was found, Western Australia Police created a dedicated task force called Macro, and that name would come to stand for years of interviews, searches, theories, forensic testing, public appeals, and the long administrative labor that is easy to overlook when a case is remembered only by its ending. You can picture the task force not as a dramatic room full of sudden certainty, but as desks under fluorescent light, maps pinned to walls, ringing phones, index cards, vehicle lists, and officers reading the same statements late in the day, looking for a phrase they might have missed the first time. The work widened outward from Claremont into taxi records, nightclub witnesses, possible vehicles, and reports from people who had felt uneasy about someone they saw, and each lead had to be checked, not because every lead was likely, but because every possibility had to be treated with care. Taxi drivers were interviewed and tested because the circumstances suggested that the women may have been seeking rides home, and the idea of a person offering transport became one of the recurring themes in the investigation. It was difficult work, and sometimes dispiriting work, because many people drove through Claremont at night, many cars looked similar in poor light, and memory itself can be sincere without being exact, especially when a witness is asked to recover the details of a passing moment. The police gathered vehicle descriptions, including accounts of light-colored cars and station wagons, and they listened to people who remembered a man approaching women, or a car moving slowly, or a detail that seemed unimportant until the city began to look back. There is something deeply human in that act of looking back, because most of us move through our evenings without knowing which details matter, and by the time we are asked to remember them, they have already softened at the edges. Still, investigators had to ask, and the public had to search memory for anything useful, and in that shared effort, there was a kind of communal patience, imperfect but persistent, as Perth tried to understand what had happened in a place people had thought of as safe. The case did not become clear quickly, and perhaps that is one of the reasons it remained so present in Western Australian memory, because there was no swift arrest, no simple confession, no neatly closing door, only the long unfolding of an inquiry that stretched over birthdays, anniversaries, changes in technology, and changes in the people who carried it. In the old file, time becomes one of the main characters, not in a dramatic sense, but in the plain way that years affect everything: fading recollections, aging evidence, changing police methods, and requiring new people to learn old facts with fresh attention. By the time Ciara Glennon disappeared in March of 1997, the fear in Perth had become more defined, though the work of the investigation still had to remain measured, because public fear can move faster than evidence, and evidence is what would eventually matter most. Ciara was 27, a lawyer who had returned to Western Australia after time away, and in the early hours of the 15th of March, after an evening in Claremont, She too was seen near the familiar streets that had already become central to the investigation. Witnesses later described a woman near Sterling Highway, and accounts of a light-colored vehicle became part of the material investigators examined. One more set of recollections laid beside the earlier statements, carefully, repeatedly, with no guarantee that the pattern would yield its answer. Ciara's body was found in bushland weeks later, north of Perth, and from that point the public understanding of the case hardened into the belief that someone was moving through ordinary spaces with hidden intent. Though in this telling we can let the harder words rest and stay instead with the work that followed. There were searches across large areas, forensic collections carried out with meticulous attention, and the gathering of fibers, trace material, samples, and personal effects, all placed into systems that would outlast the first phase of the investigation by many years. If you imagine the evidence room, you might imagine shelves rather than drama, labels rather than certainty, sealed containers rather than answers, and people whose job was to preserve small things because no one yet knew which small thing might matter. That is the central patience of the Claremont case, the preservation of what could not yet speak clearly because science had not finished becoming what it would be, and a fragment that seemed limited in one decade could become meaningful in another. Among the items preserved from Ciara's case were fingernail samples, and years later those samples would become a crucial part of the prosecution case. Though even then they would be argued over with the care required in a courtroom where a person's liberty and the family's long search for answers were both at stake. There were also fibers, many thousands of them, collected from Jane and Ciara and from the places where they were found, and the amount of fiber evidence was so large that scientists eventually needed specialized methods and databases to handle it with the attention it deserved. The image is not a sudden discovery under a bright lamp, but a scientist at a bench, year after year, comparing color, composition, shape, source, and probability, knowing that a fiber is only a tiny thing until it is placed in relation to other tiny things. In that kind of work, patience is not sentimental. It is technical, disciplined, and often repetitive. Because one cannot simply feel that two things match, one has to test, compare, document, and explain the basis for every conclusion. The public knew the case as a shadow over Claremont, but inside the investigation, it must also have been a mountain of tasks, and each task was shaped by rules. Because evidence that is not handled properly can lose the very value people are hoping it will one day have. The officers and scientists did not know in those early years that the answer would eventually lead to Bradley Robert Edwards, a Telstra technician who had lived an ordinary-looking life in the same broad city where the case remained open. That is one of the quiet difficulties in retelling this case, because after the ending is known, every earlier detail can seem to point in one direction, yet the people inside the original investigation did not have that luxury. They had names, sightings, possible suspects, eliminated suspects, rumors, mistakes, and pressure. And they had a city that wanted answers, which meant the investigation had to move through many avenues that would later appear to be false turns. One man, Lance Williams, became a major person of interest for years after police surveillance and suspicion focused on him, but he maintained his innocence, and he was eventually declared no longer a person of interest. To read that part of the file is to remember that patient detective work is not only about finding the right person, but also about moving away from the wrong person when the evidence does not hold, even after time and effort have been spent. That too requires humility, because an investigation can gather momentum around a theory, and when a theory begins to look less stable, the work has to return to the evidence rather than to pride. The families, meanwhile, waited through all of it, through announcements and searches and press conferences, through anniversaries that arrived with no resolution, through the difficult experience of hearing that something new might matter, and then learning that it did not. Waiting is often described as passive, but in cases like this it is not passive at all, because families keep memory alive, answer questions again, attend hearings, speak publicly when they can, and endure the slow turning of systems that cannot move as quickly as grief. You, sitting with the file in the quiet of a late hour, might feel how much of the case is made from waiting, not empty waiting, but watchful waiting. The kind that keeps a lamp on in a room long after everyone else has gone to bed. The investigators waited for leads, scientists waited for better tools, Families waited for news, and evidence waited in its containers, not changing in itself, but becoming newly legible as the world around it changed. In the early 2000s, the case was already old enough to be called cold by some people, though to those closest to it, that word may have sounded too simple, because a file can sit quietly without ever being forgotten. Cold case work has a different temperature than an urgent search, because the first rush has passed, but the obligation remains, and sometimes the slower pace allows a different kind of attention to appear. New detectives can read old statements without having lived through the first assumptions, and new scientists can test old material with methods that were not available when the evidence was first collected. There is a quiet dignity in that process, because it admits that the first investigation, however committed, may not have had all the tools it needed, and that justice, when it comes late, may arrive through the careful joining of old work and new possibility. The Claremont case would eventually depend on that joining, on preserved forensic material, on the slow development of DNA analysis, on fiber comparison, on vehicle records, and on the recognition that a past offense could connect to the later cases in a way that had not been clear at the time. Long before the arrest in 2016, there had been incidents involving Edwards that were later understood as part of the larger picture, including an attack in Huntingdale in 1988 and an assault at Karrakatta Cemetery in 1995. Those matters are difficult to mention in a sleep narration, and we can leave them described only in the broadest terms, because what matters here is not the detail of harm, but the way old evidence from those earlier offenses helped investigators finally understand who had been moving through the edges of the case. A piece of fabric from the Huntingdale matter, preserved across the years, became important because DNA connected that earlier incident to Edwards, and the Karrakatta matter also became part of the pattern presented in court. There is a lesson in preservation there, and it is almost quiet enough to miss, because someone had to keep the material, label it, store it, and treat it as worth retaining long before anyone knew what it might prove. In a sense, the case was solved by the people who did not throw things away, and by the systems that allowed small pieces of the past to remain available to the future. The breakthrough did not erase the earlier years, and it did not bring Ciara home, or return Jane and Ciara to the lives that were taken from them, but it did show how evidence can wait longer than memory, and how a file can remain open until the world has better questions to ask of it. By 2016, the investigation had been running in one form or another for roughly 2 decades, and the city that had once watched the case unfold in real time had changed around it. People who had been young in 1996 had families of their own, officers had retired, technology had advanced, and Claremont streets had absorbed new shops, new traffic, new routines, while the old names remained fixed in public memory. Then, on the 22nd of December, 2016, Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested, and a case that many people had feared might never reach a courtroom began its slow movement toward trial. Even then, the answer was not presented as a simple ending, because an arrest is not a conviction, and the work still had to be tested in the formal, careful space of the Supreme Court of Western Australia. The trial that began in late 2019 was long, detailed, and heard by Justice Stephen Hall without a jury, and the judgment that followed would run to hundreds of pages, reflecting not only the size of the case, but the care required in weighing evidence gathered across so many years. The court heard about DNA, fibers, vehicles, timelines, earlier offenses, witness accounts, and the many ways the prosecution sought to connect Edwards to Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, while the defense challenged the interpretation and reliability of key evidence. This is where the patient work of the investigation becomes almost architectural, because the case was not built from one single beam, but from many supports, each examined for weakness, each placed beside the others. The DNA from Ciara's fingernails became one of the most important pieces, and although the defense raised questions about contamination, the prosecution argued that the evidence could be understood reliably within the wider context of the case. The fiber evidence also mattered deeply, because scientists had compared fibers from the victims and from related scenes with fibers associated with vehicles and clothing, including the kind of Telstra-issued Holden Commodore Edwards had driven during the relevant period. You might pause here over the word fiber, because it sounds almost too small for the weight placed upon it. A thread, a fragment, something that clings without being noticed. Yet, in forensic work, such fragments can hold a quiet kind of testimony. The Chem Center work involved thousands of fibers, examined and grouped with care, and by the time investigators had Edwards as a suspect, scientists could compare what had once been unmatched material against items connected to him. This is not the kind of revelation that belongs to thunder or flashing lights, but to microscopes, databases, notebooks, and the steady attention of people who understand that a small match is only useful when it is honestly earned. There was also the matter of vehicles, especially the white Telstra station wagon associated with Edwards, and witnesses who had remembered vehicles in and around Claremont years earlier became part of the slow reconstruction. A vehicle can be both ordinary and important, especially in a city where people drive home from late nights out, and the question of who offered rides, who had access to which car, and where a work vehicle might have been seen, became part of the wider pattern. The prosecution did not ask the court to believe in one isolated coincidence, but to consider how DNA, fibers, vehicle evidence, prior conduct, and opportunity came together in a way that pointed toward Edwards. The defense, as it had every right to do, tested those claims and urged caution, because the law requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, and even in a case that had carried public emotion for so long, the court had to remain careful. That care is important to the story, not as a technical aside, but as a human safeguard, because justice cannot be rushed simply because grief has waited a long time. In September of 2020, Justice Hall found Edwards guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, and not guilty of the murder of Sarah Spears, because the evidence in Sarah's case did not meet the criminal standard required for conviction. That distinction matters, and it should be allowed to rest plainly, because the court could recognize the closeness of the cases and still maintain the burden of proof, which is one of the quiet disciplines of a legal system doing its work. For Sarah's family, the outcome left a space that no judgment could fill, because her whereabouts remain unknown, and the absence at the beginning of the file remains an absence at its later pages. For Jane and Ciara's families, the verdicts brought a form of answer after years of waiting. Though an answer in such a case is never the same thing as restoration, and it does not return the lost years. In December of 2020, Edwards was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 40 years, and the court acknowledged the seriousness of what had finally been proved after the long investigation. The public chapter of the case had reached its legal conclusion, but the quieter chapter, the one held by families and by the city's memory, could not be concluded in the same way. When you sit with the Claremont case at night, as though the papers were spread across a desk and the house around you had gone quiet, the thing that remains is not only the name of the man convicted, but the long patience of everyone who kept returning to the evidence. There were detectives who retired before the case was resolved, scientists who examined fibers by the thousands, officers who chased old vehicle records, witnesses who tried to remember the shape of a car in the dark, and families who carried names through years when nothing seemed to change. The solving of the case, after more than 20 years, was not a single moment so much as a convergence, with old evidence meeting new science, and old witness statements meeting fresh analysis, and a city's unfinished question finally entering a courtroom where it could be answered in part. And that phrase, in part, is important, because Sarah Spears is still missing, and any honest retelling has to leave room for what is not known even while acknowledging what was finally proved. So the file does not close with a perfect line drawn under every question, but with a quieter understanding of how long truth can take, how carefully it must be handled, and how even the smallest preserved trace can matter when the years have carried almost everything else away. Source note, not part of the voiceover. Key factual grounding includes the Western Australian Supreme Court judgment summary, noting the scale of the trial, with 95 sitting days, 240 witnesses, and 2,879 exhibits. ABC reporting on the DNA and fiber evidence, and ABC and Guardian reporting on the verdict and sentence. abc.net.au, +3 lawsocietywar.asn.au, +3 abc.net.au, +3 the word solved can sound very final when it appears in a headline, as though a door has closed with a firm and certain click. But in a case like Claremont, the more truthful word may be assembled, because the answer was put together slowly from pieces that had waited a very long time. Some pieces were practical, like rosters and vehicle records, and the kind of ordinary paperwork that rarely feels important when it is first written down, while others were almost invisible, the small traces that clung to fabric or rested beneath a fingernail, silent until science learned how to hear them more clearly. If you were the person opening one of those old boxes years later, you would not be lifting a finished answer from the shelf, but returning to a question that had been asked many times before, with the hope that the evidence might now be able to answer differently. That is one of the reasons cold case work can feel so patient, because it is not only about finding new things, but about meeting old things again, with better tools, steadier hands, and perhaps a little more humility than the first search allowed. In the first years of Task Force Macro, the number of possible paths was immense, and it is easy, from the calm distance of later knowledge, to forget how wide the field must have looked to investigators who did not yet know the name that would eventually matter. They had to examine the world as it was, not as it would later appear, which meant speaking to people who had driven taxis, worked in hotels, lived near the route, owned similar cars, or behaved in ways that seemed worth understanding. Some leads would have felt promising for a while and then grown thin under scrutiny, while others would have remained in the background, not dismissed entirely, but waiting for some other piece of information to make them either clearer or less likely. This is the unglamorous part of detective work, the part made from checking and rechecking, from accepting that a report can be sincere but mistaken, and from knowing that no witness should be treated as a machine for perfect memory. A person might remember a car as white when it was light grey, or place a moment slightly earlier than it happened, or recall a face with confidence because fear had sharpened one detail while softening another. And still, those memories mattered, because each one had been offered by someone trying to help, someone who had looked back into the fog of an ordinary night and tried to bring forward whatever remained. The investigators gathered those fragments because there was no other honest way to proceed, and the accumulation itself became a kind of map, with darker patches where details overlapped and lighter places where uncertainty remained. You can imagine the case room after an evening shift, when the voices have thinned and the paperwork lies in stacks, and someone stands before a board of times and places, not expecting sudden clarity, but still unwilling to stop looking. There is a quiet discipline in that unwillingness, because perseverance is not the same as insistence, and good investigators have to keep moving without forcing the evidence to say what it has not yet said. For years, the Claremont inquiry had to live inside that discipline, with public pressure on one side and legal responsibility on the other, while families waited for an answer that could not be manufactured simply because it was needed. The phone calls, the sightings, the fibers, the vehicles, the earlier incidents, the later testing, each belonged to its own small room in the larger house of the case. And only very slowly did the doors between those rooms begin to open. The earlier Huntingdale matter is important here, not because we need to dwell on what happened, but because a small piece of preserved material from that old file would eventually help form a bridge across the years. It had sat in police possession from an incident that happened before the Claremont disappearances, kept as evidence from a different matter, and for a long time it did not carry the meaning it would later receive. Evidence can be like that, almost modest in its first appearance, because it does not announce its future value, and the people responsible for storing it have to act as though tomorrow may know something today does not. When forensic testing improved, and when investigators began looking again across old material with new methods, that preserved evidence became part of a chain that reached toward Bradley Edwards. The link did not appear as a theatrical revelation, but as the product of laboratory work, comparison, documentation, and review. And in that slowness, there was a kind of strength. A result had to be repeatable, explainable, and able to survive challenge, because in a case that had carried so much public feeling, nothing fragile could be allowed to stand in place of proof. The Caracatta matter, from the year before Ciara disappeared, would also become part of the picture, and again, it is enough to say that the court later accepted Edwards' responsibility for that earlier offense. That earlier offense mattered because it placed a known person in a pattern of conduct, and it helped the prosecution show more than a chance overlap between old events and the later Claremont cases. But you can also feel, beneath the legal reasoning, the strange heaviness of time, because events that once stood apart in separate folders were eventually brought together on one table, each changing the way the others could be understood. One folder alone may have looked incomplete, and another may have seemed troubling but limited. Yet when placed beside the later forensic evidence, the earlier material began to speak in a more connected way. This is why cold case investigators often return not only to the famous file, but to neighboring files, to old reports that might have seemed peripheral, to records of offenses that were never forgotten but had not yet found their place. They look sideways as well as forward, because sometimes the missing connection is not inside the central box at all, but in another box on another shelf, labeled under a different date. And in the Claremont case, the shelves were many, because the investigation had generated an enormous archive of statements, forensic items, elimination samples, suspect files, vehicle inquiries, and records of public appeals. To search such an archive is not simply to read it, but to organize it in the mind, to ask which details are firm, which are uncertain, which were assumptions, and which might become more important under new light. A detective returning to those records years later would have to resist both despair and overconfidence, because the file was too large for easy answers, yet too important to allow weariness to become the final word. So the work continued, and if you listen carefully to the years, you can hear the quiet sounds of it, papers being copied, exhibits being signed out, old names being typed into databases, and scientists looking again at fibers that had waited in their envelopes. Fibers are humble things, and in daily life they are nearly beneath notice, because they cling to seats and clothing and carpets, moving from one place to another without intention. But in forensic work, their very smallness can become useful, especially when a particular color, composition, and source can be compared against the movements of a person, a vehicle, or an item of clothing. The Claremont fiber evidence was complex, because there were many fibers and each had to be treated with caution, since a fiber can travel innocently as well as meaningfully, and the task is to distinguish possibility from probability. Investigators and scientists examined fibers associated with the victims, with vehicles with Telstra-issued materials, and with clothing connected to Edwards, building an argument that depended on patterns rather than a single lonely thread. A blue-grey fiber, a black polyester fiber, a trace linked to a vehicle interior, a trace linked to work clothing, each had to be considered in relation to where it was found, how rare it was, and what other explanations might exist. None of this is quick work, and it is not work that lends itself to easy retelling, because the power of it lies in accumulation, in the patient noticing of many small correspondences that begin to make chance feel less likely. When you imagine a forensic scientist at a microscope, it may help to imagine not excitement but steadiness, because the work requires the quiet refusal to rush past what is inconvenient, uncertain, or difficult to classify. The scientist must be careful with language, careful with conclusions, careful with every step that connects the physical trace to the courtroom sentence, because precision is part of compassion too. A family waiting for answers deserves evidence that has been handled with care, and an accused person deserves evidence that has been tested with care, and those two obligations meet in the same measured discipline. So the fibers waited, and the reports grew, and the case moved across decades. While outside the forensic rooms, Perth kept living around the memory of Claremont. The pubs and streets remained, though the feeling attached to them had changed. And for many people, the western suburbs carried a second map beneath the visible one, a map made from remembered headlines and cautions passed between friends. Parents warned daughters, friends planned rides home more carefully, and people who had once wandered late streets with little thought began to notice cars slowing near curbs, even when those cars belonged to nothing more than ordinary night traffic. Fear can become part of a city's weather, not always visible but present in decisions, in glances, in the way people hold their keys a little tighter while walking from light into shadow. Yet the people in the case files were more than the fear that followed, and it is important to return to them with gentleness, because Sarah, Jane, and Ciara were not defined by the investigation that came after them. Sarah was 18, at the beginning of adult life, and the fact that she remains missing gives her part of the story a particular quietness, because absence asks questions that even a verdict cannot settle. Jane was 23, known for her kindness and ease with children, and the recollections of those who loved her have always carried something warmer than the cold language of evidence. Ciara was 27, intelligent and capable, a lawyer with a life that had already crossed distances and returned home, and the records of the case hold only a small portion of who she was. A court can name facts, and police can build timelines, but the fullness of a person remains with those who knew the everyday things, the tone of a laugh, the habits of a morning, the particular way someone entered a room. That is why a gentle retelling has to move carefully, always remembering that the case is not simply a puzzle to be admired for its solution, but a long human sorrow that demanded an answer. The answer, when it came, depended not only on what had been found in the 1990s, but on what had been kept. There is a difference between finding and keeping, and cold case work often depends on that difference, because the original investigators may collect something whose meaning belongs to another generation of testing. In the Claremont investigation, forensic samples and trace evidence were preserved across changes in personnel, changes in technique, and changes in public attention, and that preservation gave later investigators something real to return to when technology had moved forward. Without that continuity, the case might have remained only memory, and memory, however sincere, cannot always cross the distance into proof. But the evidence was there, and as DNA methods became more sensitive, the old material could be asked new questions, including questions that earlier testing could not have answered with the same confidence. DNA is often spoken of as though it provides instant clarity, but in real investigations it requires context, controls, interpretation, and caution, especially when samples are old, limited, or potentially mixed with other material. The DNA associated with Ciara's fingernails became central because it was both intimate and difficult to explain innocently, and the court later considered it alongside the broader evidentiary picture. The defense questioned whether contamination might account for the result, and that challenge mattered because it forced the prosecution to show why the evidence should still be relied upon. In a courtroom, certainty is not a feeling. It is a conclusion reached after alternatives have been weighed and after the evidence has been tested in the open, under rules that require patience from everyone. The judge had to read deeply, listen carefully, and write at length, because a case of such size cannot be answered with a simple impression, no matter how long the community has waited. For those outside the courtroom, it may have seemed that 2 decades of waiting should make the conclusion obvious once an arrest had been made. But the law does not work that way, and it should not. Each charge had to be considered separately, and each piece of evidence had to be placed where it belonged, neither exaggerated nor ignored, because justice is most trustworthy when it resists the temptation to become merely satisfying. That is why Sarah's case remained unresolved in the legal sense, despite the connections and the surrounding circumstances, because the evidence was not enough for a conviction on that charge. This distinction can feel painful, and it is painful, but it also shows the discipline of the court, which could not fill the gap simply because everyone wished it could be filled. Sarah's absence still sits at the beginning of the Claremont file, and in some ways it is the quietest part of the whole case, because no place of recovery exists where the search can rest. People have searched, appealed, remembered, and hoped, and still the question remains, held by her family and by investigators as something unfinished. In sleep, we do not need to force that question toward an answer it does not yet have. We can simply acknowledge it with respect and let the uncertainty remain where the truth has not arrived. The solved part of the Claremont case is therefore not the whole story, but it is still a remarkable story of endurance, of evidence kept safe, of old crimes connected by new science, and of people who continued after the first urgency had passed. When Bradley Edwards was arrested just before Christmas in 2016, many people in Western Australia would have heard the news with a mixture of relief and disbelief, because the case had been present for so long that it had almost become part of the background. A person can grow used to an unanswered question, not because it stops mattering, but because life has to move around it, and then one day the question changes shape. For the families, that moment must have been more complicated than any headline could express, because an arrest can open old pain even as it offers the possibility of long-delayed clarity. There would be more waiting after the arrest, More hearings, more legal preparation, more forensic explanation, and more public attention, all of it moving at the slow pace required by a case with so much history. The trial did not begin immediately, and when it did begin, it unfolded over many months, with witnesses called, exhibits handled, arguments made, and the careful structure of the prosecution case laid out piece by piece. By then, the case belonged not only to police memory, but to legal record, and every detail had to survive the transition from investigation to proof. That transition is harder than it may seem, because an investigation may hold many suspicions, while a court can only convict on evidence that meets a demanding standard. The long years of work had narrowed toward that standard, and the courtroom became the place where the patience of decades was finally tested. The evidence concerning Edwards's employment at Telstra mattered because it connected him to particular vehicles, uniforms, and fibers, and because his work gave him movements and access that could be examined against the timeline. Telstra vehicles were common enough to be ordinary, but specific enough to matter when compared with witness accounts, fiber findings, and records of who had which vehicle at which time. Again, the case did not rest on one thing alone, and this is important, because the strength of the final prosecution case came from the way different kinds of evidence leaned toward the same conclusion. A witness might remember a vehicle, and a fiber might suggest contact with a vehicle, and a work record might show access to a vehicle, and DNA might place a person within a much more direct frame. Each piece had limits, but together they made a pattern the court accepted for Jane and Ciara, while still refusing to go beyond the evidence in Sarah's charge. That careful separation is one of the most sobering aspects of the judgment, because it reminds us that truth, evidence, and proof are related but not always identical in what they can offer. Investigators may believe, families may feel, communities may infer, but courts must decide according to what has been proved beyond reasonable doubt. And the Claremont case shows both the power and the restraint of that principle. For Jane and Ciara, the court found the proof sufficient, and for Sarah, the court did not, leaving a legal silence where many had hoped for a fuller answer. The silence did not erase her, and it did not close the search for her, because unresolved does not mean abandoned. It simply means the file keeps a place open. Over the years, police have continued to hold hope that information might yet emerge about Sarah, and in cases like this, even a small truthful detail can matter, because the past is never entirely unreachable while someone still remembers it. A person may have carried a memory privately for years, thinking it too small or too uncertain, and then later understand that the size of a detail is not always visible from the outside. This is why public appeals in old cases continue, and why investigators sometimes ask people to come forward even after decades, because the missing part of a timeline may rest in the memory of someone who never considered themselves important. Perhaps they saw a vehicle, or heard a comment, or knew someone's routine, or held on to an uneasy feeling they could not explain at the time. Not every memory will be accurate, and not every lead will be useful, but the act of offering it can still be part of the patient work, provided it is received with care and checked with the same discipline as everything else. The Claremont case teaches that patience is not passivity, because the case moved while it waited, through storage, testing, review, elimination, renewed analysis, and eventually arrest, trial, verdict, and sentence. It teaches that old evidence has a future, and that the smallest preserved trace can outlast denial, distance, and the fading of public attention. It also teaches that families live inside the years of a case in a way outsiders cannot fully understand. Because for the public, a cold case may return in anniversaries or news reports, while for families, it is part of ordinary days. A kettle boils, a calendar turns, a birthday arrives, and beneath the common rhythm of life there remains a question that no one else can feel in quite the same way. That is why the long solution of the Claremont case should be told quietly, without triumphal noise, because what was solved was not an abstract mystery, but part of a long sorrow. The police work mattered, the science mattered, the courtroom mattered, and yet the center of the story is still the lives interrupted, and the people who kept loving them. As the night deepens in this telling, you might imagine the case file not as a source of alarm, but as a record of many people refusing to let care disappear into time. There are pages filled with ordinary language, witness names, dates, maps, vehicle makes, laboratory notes, and court references, and each page is one small act of keeping. Some pages would have been written in the first urgency of 1996, when Ciara was missing and everyone still hoped the answer might be close. Others would have been written after Jane was found, when the inquiry widened and the fear became harder to dismiss. More would have been added after Ciara, when the task force had to face the likelihood that the same hidden hand had moved through more than one life. And later still, new pages would be added by scientists and cold case detectives, by lawyers and judges, by people whose work belonged to the long second life of the investigation rather than its beginning. A case file grows like that, not neatly, not in perfect order, but by accumulation, with old pages gaining new meaning as later pages are placed behind them. You can turn those pages slowly now, in imagination, and notice that nothing in them asks you to hurry. The streets are still there, the dates are still there, the names are still there, and the answer, though it came late and only in part, came through the same patient act of returning again and again to what had been preserved. One of the strange comforts of an old investigation is that time, which first seems to damage everything, can sometimes become the very thing that allows a case to be seen more clearly, because distance changes the shape of assumptions and gives later eyes permission to ask slower questions. A detective who comes to a file after many years is not untouched by the sorrow inside it, but they are free from some of the first pressure. And sometimes that freedom allows them to notice a connection that once disappeared inside the noise of a much larger search. In the Claremont case, the early pressure was enormous, not only because the disappearances were frightening, but because they happened in familiar places where people had once felt they understood the ordinary rules of a night out, a lift home, a friend waiting nearby. Public fear can be useful when it brings witnesses forward, yet it can also flood an inquiry with uncertain information, and the investigators had to receive all of it without allowing the flood itself to decide what was true. The record of those years is filled with the patient sorting of what might matter from what probably did not, and the distinction was not always obvious at first glance. A person might ring police because a neighbor owned a light-colored car, or because someone had made an unsettling remark, or because a memory from a late night suddenly seemed to belong to the case, and each report had to be treated as part of the wider human effort to help. Many of those reports would lead nowhere, but even that phrase can sound too dismissive because a lead that leads nowhere still has value if it removes uncertainty, narrows a field, or prevents an assumption from growing unchecked. This is the quieter arithmetic of detective work, where progress is sometimes measured not by finding the answer at once, but by reducing the number of wrong answers that can still stand. You can imagine an officer making a notation beside a name, not with triumph, not with disappointment, but with a kind of steady acceptance, because the work of ruling out is still work, and it protects the integrity of what remains. In a long case, that integrity becomes precious, because the more time passes, the more tempting it may be for people outside the file to prefer a story that feels complete over an account that is only partly proven. The investigators could not afford that temptation, and neither could the court many years later, because the Claremont case required a careful respect for what was known, what was likely, and what could not be carried across the threshold into proof. That is why the eventual resolution feels both substantial and incomplete, as though a lamp has been placed in a long corridor, illuminating much of the passage while leaving one closed door at the far end. Ciara's part of the case remains that closed door, and returning to her name is not a disruption in the story, but a necessary act of attention. She was the first of the three to disappear, and because she was not found, the evidence connected to her was thinner, more dependent on sightings, movements, and the grim difficulty of absence. Absence can be harder to work with than a physical scene because it leaves investigators trying to understand not only what happened, but where the evidence might have gone, and whether it existed in recoverable form at all. The phone call for a taxi gave police a time and place, and that time and place became a marker to which the inquiry returned. But after that point, the line became faint. People remembered possible sightings, and investigators studied them, yet the court later found that the evidence was not enough to prove Edwards's guilt for Ciara's murder beyond reasonable doubt. There is no need to soften that fact, and no need to make it harsher than it already is. because it stands as one of the most difficult truths in the final judgment. The justice system can sometimes answer only the questions for which evidence has survived. And when evidence has not survived, or was never found, the ache of uncertainty remains outside the courtroom's reach. For Sarah's family, that uncertainty is not theoretical, and it is not a footnote to the solved portions of the case. It is a daily reality that has endured across decades, while other parts of the investigation move toward conviction, sentencing, and public retrospection. When you think of cold cases, it is helpful to remember that families do not experience them in the tidy sequence of a documentary or a judgment, with facts presented in order and conclusions at the end. They live them in ordinary time among groceries, workdays, family gatherings, and quiet rooms, where the missing person is present in a way that cannot be explained by legal documents alone. A missing person remains part of the weather of a family, sometimes like rain on the roof, sometimes like a pressure in the air before dawn, and always as someone whose absence has a specific shape. That shape does not dissolve because another part of the case has reached an answer, though answers can still matter deeply and can still bring a measure of relief, recognition, or accountability. So the Claremont case asks us to hold more than one truth at once. And perhaps that is why it suits a slow telling, because quick stories do not always have room for complicated quiet. They prefer clean endings, clear villains, sudden turns, and satisfying final lines, while real investigations often end unevenly, with some questions answered carefully, and others left open because the evidence has not followed them home. In the years before the arrest, one of the most important acts was not dramatic at all. It was the decision to keep going through the old material. The file was enormous, and it would have been easy for any one detail to be buried beneath the weight of all the others, especially when earlier suspects had been investigated, earlier theories had been pursued, and public pressure had shifted over time. But a cold case review can behave like a quiet tide, moving over the same ground in a different way, carrying away what is loose and leaving exposed what has remained fixed. Investigators revisited statements, forensic results, and known offences from the broader period, asking whether the Claremont disappearances might be connected to other events that had not been fully understood in relation to them. The Huntingdale evidence, preserved from 1988, became important because later forensic work connected it to Edwards, and that connection gave investigators a way of seeing a person who had not been at the center of the original public story. The Caracata offense from 1995 sat closer in time to the Claremont disappearances, and it later became another part of the prosecution's account of Edwards' conduct. The careful point is not that one old incident simply solved another, but that the links between them changed the way investigators could interpret the forensic landscape around the Claremont cases. In patient detective work, a connection is often not a single bridge, but a series of stepping stones, each one small enough to require caution, yet firm enough to support the next step when properly tested. The DNA evidence from the Huntingdale material did not announce the whole answer by itself, but it placed Edwards in a position where other evidence could be looked at with renewed purpose. Once his name was in view, investigators could compare records, vehicles, fibers, and timelines in a more focused way, and the old archive began to rearrange itself around a person who had once been hidden inside ordinary life. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of solved cold cases, though it can be told calmly, because the eventual subject often turns out not to have lived at the edge of the world, but within it. Edwards worked, married, lived in suburbs, drove on familiar roads, and appeared to many people as one more person moving through the city's routines. There is no need to decorate that with drama, because the plainness of it is enough. A long investigation often has to reckon with the possibility that the person responsible did not look like a monster in daily life, but like a co-worker, a neighbor, a technician, someone with keys, roots, and explanations for being in certain places. That is partly why evidence matters so much, because appearances are poor instruments for truth, and ordinary surfaces can mislead both fear and trust. The case against Edwards did not depend on how he seemed, but on what could be traced, tested, compared, and placed before a court. His employment with Telstra became significant because it provided a framework for understanding vehicles, uniforms, fibers, and access all of which could be checked against the long-remembered movements around Claremont. A white Holden Commodore station wagon, used in connection with his work, became one of the important images in the later case, because witnesses had spoken of vehicles that could fit within that broad description. The vehicle was not important as a symbol, but as an object with seats, carpets, fibers, work history, and a possible relationship to the traces recovered years earlier. In the ordinary life of a car, fibers move constantly, from clothing to upholstery, from upholstery to clothing, from one passenger to another, leaving almost invisible signs of contact. Most of the time, those signs mean nothing to anyone. But when a person disappears, and when a body is found, and when a car is later suspected of being part of the route between the two, even a fiber can become part of the patient's search for truth. The prosecution's fiber case was intricate, and it required the court to listen to expert evidence about source, comparison, and significance, without treating any single fiber as if it carried more weight than it could bear. That careful moderation is important, because forensic evidence can seem more certain to the public than it sometimes is, and a good courtroom has to ask not only whether two things are similar, but how meaningful that similarity really is. In Claremont, the fibers were not alone, and their importance rested partly in their number, their type, their associations, and the way they fitted with other evidence. They were like low notes in a larger piece of music, almost unnoticed separately, but shaping the whole when heard together. You can imagine the evidence as a woven cloth, not because every thread was perfect, but because enough threads crossed and tightened to form a pattern that Justice Hall found compelling in relation to Jane and Ciara. The word pattern can be dangerous if used carelessly, because humans are very good at seeing shapes where none exist. But in this case, the court's task was to decide whether the pattern was supported by evidence rather than by expectation. That task took months of hearing and many hundreds of pages of judgment, which is another way of saying that patience remained necessary even at the end. The families had already waited more than 20 years, and then they had to wait through the formality of testimony, submissions, legal argument, and written reasons, because even late justice must move through its proper steps. A courtroom is not a place designed for emotional ease, and yet it can offer a kind of structure around pain, allowing facts to be named and tested in a way that private grief cannot do by itself. For those following the trial, the details may have seemed overwhelming, with evidence reaching back to the 1980s, moving through the 1990s, and returning again to forensic advances of the 21st century. But for the judge, every detail had to be weighed, and for the families, every detail belonged to someone real. That is the double burden of such a trial, because the law must abstract enough to be fair, while the people most affected cannot help but feel the human meaning beneath every exhibit. An exhibit number may refer to a sample, a fiber, a photograph, a document, or a recording. But behind the number is a moment in a life, and behind that moment is a person who was loved. As you let the story move slowly, it may help to think of the trial not as a sudden climax, but as the last long reading of a file that had been growing for more than 2 decades. Witnesses came and went, experts explained, lawyers questioned, and the judge listened, sometimes to matters that were technical and dry, sometimes to matters that carried the weight of years. The old Claremont nights were reconstructed in language, and the streets appeared again through testimony, not as they had felt to the young people walking them, but as they could be understood from records, memories, and evidence. Bayview Terrace, Sterling Highway, the Continental Hotel, the Club Bayview area, the roads leading away from the suburb, all became points on a careful map. Maps are useful because they make distance visible, but they cannot show the emotional distance between a last known sighting and the years that follow. Only the families can know that distance fully. Still, maps helped investigators because a road network can reveal opportunity, timing, routes, and the ordinary ways a person might leave a busy area without being noticed in the way they should have been. Claremont was a place of movement, especially on weekend nights, and movement can make a crime harder to see because everyone is going somewhere, everyone is leaving, waiting, crossing, calling, or looking for a ride. In such a setting, the person who matters may not stand out sharply at the time, because a car stopping near the curb or a man speaking to someone may seem ordinary until later. That is the tragedy of hindsight. You see the moment after you know its importance, but the people living through it were inside the ordinary night, with music fading from venues, friends separating for home, and streetlights falling across wet or dry pavement according to the season. The investigators had to reconstruct the night without the privilege of having seen it as a whole, and every reconstruction was made from fragments that had survived. Security footage gave one kind of fragment, witness memory another, telephone records another, forensic evidence another, and none of them alone could hold the whole story. But together, over time, they gave the investigation something like a spine, a structure strong enough to support new analysis when Edwards finally became the focus. His arrest did not happen because anyone had waited passively for luck, but because the work of comparing, preserving, and re-examining gradually narrowed the field. Even the word breakthrough can be misleading if it makes the ending sound abrupt, because many breakthroughs are only visible after years of smaller steps have made them possible. A laboratory result depends on collection, storage, cataloging, chain of custody, funding, technical skill, and the decision to test again. A suspect's name depends on older records being kept, older offenses being understood, and investigators being willing to ask whether separate matters might share one origin. A trial depends on all of that being transformed into admissible evidence, and a conviction depends on that evidence satisfying a legal standard that is rightly hard to meet. So when people say the Claremont case was solved after 20 years, what they are really saying is that many acts of patience finally met at the same point. They are saying that evidence outlasted uncertainty, that records outlasted memory, that families outlasted silence, and that investigators returned often enough for the past to become newly readable. This does not make the waiting easier. It does not redeem the loss, but it does show that time, though it takes so much, does not always have the final word. Sometimes the years carry a case farther from its beginning, and sometimes they carry it closer to its answer in ways no one could have predicted when the first report was taken. The first officers who responded to Sarah's disappearance could not have known that a future investigation would rely on forensic possibilities still developing in laboratories and casework around the world. The scientists who preserved early items may not have known which samples would become crucial, only that careful preservation was the duty placed before them. The families who made appeals could not know which person might finally listen, which investigator might finally connect a file, or which old trace might finally find its match. Yet all of them, in their separate ways, helped carry the case forward. That is the human element inside cold case work, not only brilliance or technology. Someone has to keep the name on the board. Someone has to open the box again. Someone has to believe that an unanswered file still deserves the attention of a living day. The Claremont case had many such people, some visible, many unseen, and their work formed the quiet foundation beneath the final verdicts. A person listening in the dark might imagine those unseen workers as lamplight in different rooms across the years, each one illuminating a portion of the file, none of them able to see the whole path, but all of them refusing to let the light go out. There is a softness in that image, though the facts beneath it are hard because the persistence itself belongs to the better part of human nature. We search because people matter. We preserve because memory alone may not be enough. We return because the unanswered question is still attached to a name, a family, and a life that deserves more than fading. In Claremont, that returning took 2 decades before it reached the formal answer, and even then, one part of the answer stayed beyond reach. The unresolved part should not be treated as failure alone, because the convictions for Jane and Ciara were real, and the proof that led to them was the result of remarkable persistence. But neither should the unresolved part be brushed aside, because Sarah's name belongs at the center of the story as surely as anyone's. Her case reminds us that justice can be partial without being meaningless, and that an incomplete answer can still carry truth while leaving room for grief. The streets of Claremont today belong to the present, with people going about their ordinary lives, and that ordinariness is part of what every community hopes to regain after a long fear. Still, certain places hold layers, and anyone who knows the history may feel those layers gently when passing a familiar corner, not as a demand to relive the past, but as an invitation to remember respectfully. A city does not stop being a city because sorrow once passed through it, but neither does it become innocent of memory. The work is to live and to remember and to let the names remain human rather than becoming only markers in a notorious case. So, as the file stays open in imagination, you might set down the dramatic words and keep only the patient ones. Evidence, witness, sample, fiber, record, review, family, verdict, and waiting. Each word is plain, and each one belongs to the slow path by which the Claremont case moved from fear into accountability. The path was not straight, and it was not gentle for those who had to walk it, but it was walked with persistence, across years when the answer seemed to recede, and then, very gradually, to draw nearer. And in that gradual drawing near, there is the quiet truth of the case that justice sometimes moves not like a sudden door opening, but like dawn coming into a room, pale at first, then clearer, touching one object after another, until the shape of things can finally be seen. That dawn in the Claremont case did not come all at once, because the first light fell on old exhibits, then on earlier offences, then on work records and vehicle histories, and only after many careful comparisons did it begin to reach the full shape of the man who would later stand trial. There is a kind of patience in allowing a picture to appear slowly, without darkening the parts that remain unclear and without forcing brightness into corners where the evidence has not reached. Because the truth of a cold case is often uneven, and the honesty of the telling depends on leaving that unevenness visible. The investigators who returned to the case in later years were not working in a vacuum, but in the presence of all the earlier work, all the searches and interviews, and forensic collections that had been made before their own part began. They inherited the labor of others, and that inheritance carried both weight and possibility, because every earlier decision to preserve, record, or document had created a small future opening. You can imagine a newer investigator reading an older statement, noticing the language of another era, the way addresses were written, the way a witness described a car, the way an officer noted a hesitation or a time. The paper may have aged, and the systems around it may have changed, but the essential question remained the same, and there is something quietly moving about a question surviving long enough for another generation of detectives to ask it again. Sometimes the renewed question is simple. What did we think we knew, and how do we know it? Sometimes it is more delicate. What did we overlook because another theory seemed stronger, or because the science of the time could not yet see what was waiting in the evidence? These are not accusations against the past, at least not necessarily, because every investigation belongs to its moment, with the tools, pressures, and assumptions available then. Cold case review is partly an act of respect for earlier work, because it says that the first search mattered enough to be revisited, and that the effort already spent may still contain something capable of answering. In Claremont, the first search had been vast, and the later search had to move through that vastness with care, not tearing it apart, but listening for what had remained steady beneath the accumulation of leads. A lead can become famous inside a case for a while, especially when it seems to explain many things at once. But fame inside an investigation is not the same as truth, and time can be a patient corrector. The focus on other persons of interest had to be assessed again and again, and when the evidence did not hold, investigators eventually had to move away from those paths, however much energy had once been spent upon them. That kind of course correction is rarely dramatic from the outside, but inside a long inquiry it can be one of the most important forms of courage, because it asks people to loosen their grip on an idea that may have become familiar. A wrong theory can be strangely comfortable, not because it is good, but because it gives shape to uncertainty, and letting it go means returning to the wider darkness with only the evidence for company. Yet that is what patient investigation requires, and the Claremont case shows how long that requirement can last, because the eventual answer was not reached by defending the first theory forever, but by allowing the evidence to lead elsewhere. The name Bradley Edwards did not carry the public weight of the case in the early years, and that fact is itself a reminder of how hidden an answer can be within ordinary records. He was not introduced to the public as someone from a distant world, but as a former Telstra technician, someone whose employment, vehicle access, and earlier conduct could be placed beside the old evidence and examined. The ordinariness of that description matters, because it resists the false comfort of imagining that terrible acts are always accompanied by obvious signs, clear warnings, or a face that announces itself to the world. Much more often, investigations have to move beyond appearance, beyond reputation, beyond surface impressions, and toward the quieter authority of trace, record, timing, and corroboration. In the Claremont case, that movement was slow but decisive, and once Edwards became visible to investigators, the scattered materials of the old file could be asked whether they knew him. That is a strange phrase, perhaps, but evidence can sometimes seem to know more than people do because it has no motive to remember wrongly and no wish to protect itself from what it contains. A fiber does not understand what it means, and a sample does not know what grief it may one day address. Yet both can remain where human memory has faded. The difficulty is that evidence cannot speak on its own, and so people must interpret it cautiously, methodically, and with enough humility to know the difference between a whisper and a clear statement. The scientists in the Claremont case had to listen in that way, through microscopes, chemical analysis, DNA profiling, and comparison work that was careful enough to be explained under questioning. A courtroom is not satisfied by mystery, and it is not supposed to be. It asks for method, for reasoning, for the steps between observation and conclusion. This is why the forensic story, though quieter than a public appeal or an arrest, sits at the center of how the case was finally solved after so many years. The fiber evidence connected the ordinary interiors and materials of vehicles and clothing to the places where Jane and Ciara were found, and it did so through accumulation rather than through one isolated sign. The DNA evidence gave a different kind of connection, more personal, more direct, and the combination of those two kinds of trace helped the court understand the larger evidentiary pattern. But even then, the evidence did not relieve the court of caution, because the older the case, the more carefully questions of storage, handling, transfer, and contamination have to be examined. That examination can feel slow, especially to those waiting for a result, but slowness is part of the protection that allows a verdict to carry weight. You can picture Justice Hall in the long months after the evidence had been heard, surrounded not by atmosphere or drama, but by transcripts, submissions, expert reports, authorities, and the many details that had to be placed in order. The written judgment was itself another form of patient labor, because it had to explain why some evidence was accepted, why other evidence was limited, and why the conclusions differed between the charges. In that written form, the case moved from public fear into legal reasoning, and although reasoning can seem dry compared with grief, it is one of the ways a society tries to answer harm without losing its steadiness. A verdict reached too quickly might satisfy the ear for a moment, but a verdict reached carefully gives the families something more durable, even when that durability cannot remove their sorrow. For Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, the court found that the evidence proved Edward's guilt, and the words of the verdict entered the public record after so many years of uncertainty. For Sarah Spears, the court did not make the same finding, and her name continued to hold the open space it had held from the beginning, the space where a missing person remains missing and a family continues to wait. This is not a contradiction in the moral sense, though it may feel emotionally difficult, because a court can recognize the broad closeness of events while still refusing to convict without sufficient proof. The restraint can be hard to accept, but it is part of what makes the proved findings meaningful, because the court did not simply give the public the whole answer it wanted. It gave the answer the evidence could support. And so the Claremont case, even after conviction and sentence, remains a story of both resolution and incompletion, which is perhaps one reason it lingers so deeply in public memory. A fully closed story can be set down, but a partly closed story asks to be held more carefully, with attention to what has been answered and what has not. You may find, as you sit quietly with the case, that the unsolved portion changes the meaning of the solved portion, not by weakening it, but by reminding us that justice arrives within limits. It arrives through evidence rather than longing, through proof rather than certainty of feeling, through patient method rather than the understandable desire to make every grief fit neatly within the same conclusion. That is not a cold idea, even though it may sound formal. It is, in its own way, an act of care, because care must be truthful if it is to endure. The investigators who continued after the trial still had Sarah's question before them, and the public too retained the knowledge that one family had not received the same legal answer. Searches for Ciara had taken place across the years, and appeals for information continued, because the absence of a conviction did not mean the absence of an investigation. There are places in Western Australia where the landscape itself seems to hold silence, stretches of bushland and road verge, and open ground that may once have been searched, mapped, or considered. To speak of those places gently is not to make them ominous, but to acknowledge the practical reality of a search in a vast state, where distance can protect secrets simply by being distance. Search teams, officers, volunteers, and specialists worked through areas when there was reason to do so, and every search carried both hope and difficulty, because not finding something is itself an answer only in a limited way. It can tell you where the answer is not. It cannot always tell you where the answer is. And so the patient work continues in the form available to it, through appeals, records, public memory, and the possibility that someone, somewhere, may yet know a detail that has not been given. The longer a case lasts, the more a single memory can seem fragile. But sometimes people speak late because circumstances change, loyalties fade, fear lessens, or the private weight of silence becomes too heavy. Investigators know this, and families know it too, and that knowledge is why even old cases are sometimes kept in public view, not to disturb the past for its own sake, but to invite truth to come forward if it can. In the case of Claremont, public memory had already shown that it could endure, because the names were not forgotten, and the anniversaries brought renewed attention even when there was little new to say. There is a special kind of discipline in saying little when little is known, because not every silence should be filled with speculation, and not every gap should be crowded with theory. A gentle retelling should protect that silence, allowing it to remain honest, and allowing the known facts to stand without embroidery. What is known is that 3 young women disappeared from or near Claremont over a period of just over a year, that Jane and Ciara were later found, that Ciara was not, and that after more than 20 years, Bradley Edwards was convicted of the murders of Jane and Ciara. What is also known is that the investigation became one of the largest and longest in Western Australian history, drawing together police work, forensic development, public appeals, and eventually a trial of great length and detail. Those facts are plain, but they are not small. They contain families waiting through decades, officers returning to old questions, scientists handling fragile traces, and a community learning how slowly answers can arrive. The danger in a famous cold case is that the names of the victims can become familiar in a way that feels almost impersonal, as though repetition has worn away the individuality of the lives being named. A careful telling has to resist that, and it can do so not by inventing private details, but by pausing over the simple truth that each name belonged to a full person. Ciara belonged to her own life before she belonged to the case. Jane belonged to her own life before she belonged to the case. Ciara belonged to her own life before she belonged to the case, and every later document, however necessary, can only surround that truth rather than replace it. When police build a file, they must reduce life into facts, because facts are what the investigation can carry. But those facts should always be understood as the outline of something much larger. A date of birth, an address, a last sighting, a workplace, a phone call, a witness statement, each is only a narrow doorway into the person behind it. Families know the rooms beyond those doorways, the ordinary rooms of memory that a court cannot enter, and that is why the dignity of the missing and the dead depends partly on the restraint of everyone retelling the case. The Claremont investigation was public, but the grief at its center was private. The court could speak for the public record, and the police could speak for the investigation. But the deepest meanings of the losses belonged to those who loved Ciara, Jane, and Ciara in ways the file could never fully describe. As the case moved toward resolution, the public learned many details, and yet the most important things remained beyond public ownership, held in family memory and in the quiet knowledge of lives shared before the names became known to strangers. This is why the tone must stay low and respectful, because the case is not an entertainment, but an old sorrow that happened to require extraordinary detective work. And the detective work, in turn, deserves attention because it shows what persistence can do when it is joined to evidence and time. The work did not undo the harm, but it refused to let the harm remain entirely unanswered. It turned old samples into present proof. and it turned stored fibers into court evidence, and it turned a name hidden in the ordinary world into a convicted man serving a life sentence. That transformation from uncertainty to accountability is significant, yet it should be held without triumph, because the families paid for that accountability in years. More than 20 years passed between the first disappearance and the arrest, and more years passed before the trial reached its judgment and sentence. During that time, a whole generation grew older under the shadow of an unanswered case, and the people closest to it learned the particular exhaustion of hope repeatedly deferred. Hope can be tiring when it has to last that long. It can become a daily practice rather than a feeling, something renewed not because certainty is near, but because love does not know how to abandon the person it remembers. For investigators, hope had to take a more practical form, the form of procedures followed, exhibits reviewed, and old assumptions tested against new evidence. For scientists, hope may have looked like improved sensitivity in DNA analysis, better methods of comparison, and the possibility that a trace once too limited might now yield something useful. For the public, hope sometimes appeared as a press conference, an appeal, a reward notice, or the familiar image of a case being mentioned again on the evening news. Each form of hope was different, and none was enough on its own, but together they helped keep the case from disappearing into the past. There is a lesson in that, especially for anyone drawn to cold cases, not for shock, but for the patient question of how human beings continue searching when the easy chances have passed. The answer is partly systems, because police forces need cold case units, forensic storage, review processes, databases, and the resources to reopen files that no longer belong to the urgent present. But the answer is also personal, because systems are made of people, and someone has to care enough to read the old statement again, to submit the old sample again, to ask the old witness one more respectful question. In Claremont, that care stretched across departments and decades, sometimes visible in public appeals, often invisible in routine work that would never become the center of a headline. The ordinary nature of that work is what makes it so powerful in a bedtime telling, because it is not quick, not sharp, not loud, but steady in the way of rain finding its path down glass. The rain does not hurry. It simply continues, and over time, continuing can alter the shape of stone, or cleanse an old window enough for a little more light to pass through. So the Claremont case becomes, among other things, a meditation on continuity, on the way a society carries an unanswered wrong across years without letting the file fall completely out of reach. It is also a meditation on evidence and on the humility required to let evidence lead at its own pace, even when the human heart wants to run ahead. When Edwards was sentenced, the legal system had reached the end of what it could do for the convictions before it. But the emotional life of the case did not end in the courtroom. Sentencing can mark accountability, and it can speak publicly about seriousness, but it cannot restore a person to a chair at the family table. It cannot return the years. What it can do, and what it did in the cases of Jane and Ciara, is make a public record of responsibility, after a long period when responsibility had remained hidden. That record matters because truth matters, and because naming responsibility is one of the few things a community can still offer when it cannot undo the loss itself. The name of the offender belongs in the record, but it should not overwhelm the names of the women whose lives are the reason the record exists. There is always a risk, in solved cases, that the person convicted becomes the center of the retelling simply because the solution gives him narrative weight. A more patient retelling can keep him in proportion. He is necessary to explain the investigation and the conviction, but he is not the heart of the story. The heart remains with Sarah, Jane, Ciara, their families, and the many people who carried the search through time. This proportion is not merely a matter of tone, but of truth, because the case began with missing women, not with the later public identification of the man convicted of 2 of their murders. The investigation's purpose was never to make a name notorious, but to answer for lives interrupted and families left waiting. When you hold that purpose in mind, the details settle differently. The fibers are not interesting because they are clever. They are important because they helped speak for people who could not speak in court. The DNA is not powerful because it feels modern. It is powerful because it connected an old trace to an accountable person after years of uncertainty. The vehicle records are not just bureaucratic leftovers. They are pieces of a route through time, showing how ordinary systems can preserve the outline of extraordinary questions. Even the old witness statements, with all their imperfections, are part of that purpose, because each witness was trying to contribute something to the search for someone else's truth. A person who saw a car, heard a voice, remembered a direction of travel, or came forward with uncertainty still participated in the wider act of care. Not every contribution solved the case, and many may have led nowhere, but the moral meaning of helping is not erased by the limitations of memory. This is why cold case files are full of human imperfection, and why that imperfection should not be mocked. People remember badly, but they often try sincerely. Investigators make choices with incomplete information. Scientists work within the limits of the methods available to them, and courts weigh what survives rather than what everyone wishes had survived. The Claremont case, in its long arc, shows all of that human limitation and all of that human persistence existing together. It is not a story of perfect systems, because no such system exists. It is a story of enough persistence, enough preservation, and enough later clarity to bring two convictions after years in which many feared there would be none. And perhaps that is why, when the case is considered late at night, the mood should not be triumph but solemn steadiness, the feeling of a lamp left on beside an old file that has finally yielded some of its truth. The file is thinner now in some ways because parts of it have been answered, yet it is heavier in others because the unanswered portion remains more visible after the solved parts have been separated out. Ciara's name remains there, and the fact of her continued absence means the case still has a margin that cannot be written over. A margin is not empty. It is the space where future information could still be written, where a memory could still arrive, where a search could still be directed, where a family's hope, however changed by time, could still find something to hold. The existence of that margin is why the story does not end cleanly, and why it should not try to. Instead, it can become quieter, settling into the recognition that some answers came because people waited actively, and one answer has not yet come despite the same long care. That recognition is not failure of compassion, it is compassion shaped by truth. And truth, in a case like this, is the only ground firm enough to stand on. Firm ground matters because so much of an old case feels uncertain, especially when the first years are filled with searching and rumor, and when every new possibility arrives carrying both hope and the quiet risk of disappointment. In Claremont, firm ground was found in records, in science, in the slow comparison of one item with another, and in the willingness to return to physical evidence when memory alone could no longer carry the weight. You can think of the investigation as a long table laid out over many years, with some objects placed there in the 1990s, others brought from older files, and still others added when technology finally allowed a more careful reading. At first, the table might have seemed crowded and difficult to understand, but gradually, as the years passed and the wrong paths were cleared away, certain objects began to belong beside one another. The public often sees only the final arrangement, the evidence lined up in court, the name of the accused, the verdict written into history, but the deeper story is the long period before arrangement was possible. That earlier period is where patient detective work lives. It lives in the hours when nothing appears to change, when a search returns without an answer, when a witness cannot remember more, when a laboratory result is inconclusive, and when a theory that once seemed promising begins to fade. It lives, too, in the decision not to mistake fading for failure, because a clue that fades may leave behind a clearer view of the remaining ground. In the Claremont investigation, thousands of people were spoken to, thousands of leads were assessed, and the scale of the inquiry became part of its identity, not as a boast, but as evidence of how much ground had to be covered. The task force had to move through the ordinary world with unusual care, because the answer, when it finally emerged, was not hidden in a remote place, but among familiar roads, familiar employers, and familiar kinds of vehicles. There is something deeply unsettling about that, though we can hold it gently, because it reminds us that the line between ordinary life and a case file can sometimes be much thinner than anyone wishes to believe. A telephone technician driving through suburban streets does not naturally become the focus of a city's longest shadow, and yet, in the later evidence, that ordinary role became part of the explanation. The work vehicle, the uniforms, the fibers, the access to streets and routes, all became meaningful only when placed within a structure of proof, and that structure took years to build. Before then, those details were simply details, scattered across different records, not yet gathered into a form that could speak clearly. This is one reason cold case work can feel almost archival, because the detective becomes part investigator, part historian, part caretaker of memory, reading the past not as a closed book, but as a text with hidden margins. You, as the quiet reader of the file, might notice how often the important things are not the loud ones, but the things that stayed where they were, waiting to be understood. A vehicle log does not know it is important. A fiber caught in fabric does not know it has traveled. A sample sealed away in storage does not know that years later a scientist will open the record again and find that it has something more to say. There is no drama in those objects by themselves, and perhaps that is why they suit a calm retelling, because their importance is not announced by noise, but revealed by attention. Attention is a kind of mercy in an investigation, especially when the people at the center of it can no longer ask for that attention themselves. It says, in a practical way, that the names still matter and that the passage of time has not dissolved the duty to look carefully. For Sarah, Jane, and Ciara, that duty was carried by many people, including family members who kept speaking their names, investigators who kept the file active, and forensic specialists who treated small traces with care. Some of those people became publicly known, while many remained simply part of the machinery of the investigation, their names not repeated in later accounts, though their work shaped the final outcome. That is common in long cases, because public memory tends to preserve the visible moments, the disappearance, the arrest, the verdict, while the invisible labor in between becomes part of the background. But the background is where much of the solution was made. The background held the careful logging of evidence, the chain of custody forms, the reviews, the re-examinations, the conversations between detectives and scientists, and the quiet recognition that a cold case must be kept alive in practical ways. Care, in this sense, is not only emotional, it is administrative, scientific, legal, and procedural, made of forms completed properly, exhibits stored properly, reports written clearly, and questions asked again when the first answer is not enough. That kind of care can seem dry on the page, but without it, the later courtroom could not have done its work. A family's need for truth has to pass through systems that may feel slow and impersonal, and yet the slowness, when it is honest, helps protect the truth from becoming only a story people wish were true. The Claremont verdicts rested on that protection, because the evidence was not merely presented, it was questioned, tested, challenged, and weighed across a long trial. The defense challenged the prosecution case in many ways, including the interpretation of forensic results and the possibility of contamination or innocent transfer, and those challenges were part of the process that gave the final findings their shape. It can be difficult, from outside, to listen to challenges in a case that has already carried so much grief, but a fair trial depends on them, and a careful conviction is stronger because of them. The court had to look at DNA not as a magic word, but as evidence, with a history, a sample with a collection point, a testing process, and a context in which its meaning had to be interpreted. It had to look at fibers not as simple matches, but as traces whose significance depended on rarity, source, movement, and the broader explanation for how they came to be where they were found. It had to look at the earlier offenses not as emotional shortcuts, but as evidence governed by legal principles, admitted and assessed for the way they related to the charges before the court. And it had to look at Sarah's case separately, even though the public naturally thought of the three women together, because the law required each charge to stand on its own evidence. This separate looking is another form of patience. It resists the pull of narrative unity, the very human desire to make three names become one complete answer, and it leaves space for the more difficult truth that the evidence was not equally strong in every part. So, when the court found Edwards not guilty of Sarah's murder, it did not erase suspicion, grief, or connection from the public mind, but it did mark the boundary of what had been proved. That boundary remains important. It is the line between what the court could say and what remains unknown. And although such a line can feel cold, it is also one of the ways a society keeps truth from being shaped entirely by longing. Longing is understandable in a case like this, and no one should judge the families or the public for wanting a complete answer after so much time. But longing cannot substitute for evidence, and perhaps the saddest wisdom of the Claremont case is that not every true ache receives a complete legal response. Jane and Ciara's families heard the court name the responsibility that had been hidden for more than 2 decades, while Sarah's family heard the limits of the proof, and both realities now live together inside the case. You can hold those realities quietly, without trying to make them comfortable. Some truths are not comfortable, even when told gently. They ask not for resolution in the listener, but for respect, for the willingness to let sorrow remain sorrow without turning it into an easier shape. In that way, the case becomes less like a puzzle and more like a landscape, with certain areas mapped in careful detail and other areas still covered in mist. The mapped areas matter because they show how evidence finally connected Edwards to Jane and Ciara, and how the court reached convictions after a very long wait. The mist matters too, because it marks Sarah's continued absence, and the reality that a family can receive part of a public answer while still waiting for the private answer that matters most. If you were walking through that landscape in thought, you might move slowly along the roads from Claremont, noticing how the city gives way to wider spaces, how the suburbs thin, how bushland and road reserves begin to appear. The investigation followed such transitions again and again, from nightlife to quiet streets, from witness accounts to search areas, from busy public places to lonely stretches where evidence was found. Those transitions are part of the geography of the case, but they should be described with care, because the land is not guilty and the places themselves have ordinary lives beyond the history attached to them. A road can be part of a case and also be a road used by commuters, families, cyclists, and people going about the work of living. A suburb can carry an old memory and still belong to the present. Claremont itself did not become only a case, though the case changed how many people heard its name, and over the years the suburb continued with shops opening, trains arriving, cafes filling, and late evening traffic passing beneath streetlights. This continuation is not disrespectful. It is how communities survive. They remember, but they also live, and sometimes the act of living beside memory is the only way a place can keep from being defined entirely by its worst association. The women themselves should be remembered in that same way, as people who lived before the case, not only as victims within it. The police file can record where Sarah was last known to be, but it cannot fully hold the life she had already lived or the future that should have opened before her. The court record can describe what happened to Jane, but it cannot contain the warmth her loved ones remembered or the everyday kindness that made her more than a name in a judgment. The trial can establish facts about Ciara's final night, but it cannot capture the full intelligence, humor, effort, and promise of the person whose absence has been carried for so long. A respectful telling returns to this often because true crime, even when softened into patient investigation, can accidentally turn people into functions of a story. Sarah, Jane, and Ciara were not functions of a story. They were daughters, friends, colleagues, and full human beings, and the investigation mattered because they mattered first. When evidence speaks for the dead or the missing, it does so only because living people have given it a voice, and that voice should remain steady, factual, and compassionate. The long hunt for the truth in Claremont also reveals how public memory can both help and hurt an investigation. Help comes when witnesses step forward, when a community remains attentive, when information is shared, and when families are supported rather than left alone with their questions. Hurt can come when rumors harden into assumed fact, when innocent people are judged by suspicion, or when the need for an answer becomes so strong that any answer begins to feel acceptable. The investigators had to work within that tension, aware of public concern but answerable to evidence. A cold case that remains famous for many years can develop its own folklore, with details repeated, simplified, altered, and sometimes misunderstood, while the official file remains far more cautious than public conversation. That difference matters, because public conversation moves easily, but evidence moves slowly, and only the slow movement could bring the Claremont case to a lawful conclusion. The patience of the case was therefore not only investigative, but cultural, because the community had to learn, again and again, that certainty could not be demanded into existence. It had to be earned, and earning it took far longer than anyone wanted. In the early years, when Task Force Macro was operating at great scale, the expectation may have been that such effort would soon produce an arrest, because large searches and intense public attention often create an impression that an answer must be near. But effort and proximity are not the same thing, and sometimes an investigation can be working very hard while the decisive connection remains outside its reach. That is a difficult truth for families, for police, and for the public, because it makes clear that dedication does not always control timing. The evidence may need technology that has not yet matured, a witness who has not yet spoken, a database that has not yet been built, or a connection between cases that no one is yet able to see. In Claremont, the eventual answer depended on several of those things, especially the later ability to connect old DNA evidence to Edwards and to interpret trace evidence within a broader pattern. The word pattern returns because it is useful, but it should be held lightly, since patterns in criminal investigation must be anchored to facts rather than simply felt. Here, the pattern was built from earlier conduct, forensic associations, vehicle evidence, opportunity, and the similarities between Jane and Ciara's cases, all assessed within the discipline of a trial. For Sarah, the pattern was not enough on its own. That may be the hardest part for a listener to accept, because human beings are natural storytellers, and we tend to assume that if two parts of a story have been proved, the third must belong in the same conclusion. But law is not storytelling in that sense. It is a method of public decision, and its care lies partly in the refusal to complete a pattern where the required proof has not been made. This refusal can feel unsatisfying, yet it is what protects everyone from the danger of conviction by association alone. In a bedtime telling, we can let that lesson settle without pressing it too sharply, because it belongs to the slow understanding of how hard justice can be. Justice is not always comfort. Sometimes it is a careful boundary drawn around what can be honestly known, while grief continues beyond the boundary. For the investigators, the verdicts must have carried complex emotions, because two convictions after so many years marked a profound achievement, while the not guilty finding on Sarah's charge left the earliest question unresolved. For forensic scientists, the trial may have affirmed the value of work that had taken years of analysis and preparation, yet the meaning of that work remained tied to human loss rather than professional satisfaction. For the community, the convictions changed the public understanding of the case, but they did not change the past that had made the case so central to Western Australian memory. And for the families, every public milestone arrived inside private grief, which is a different country altogether. The public can mark an arrest date, a verdict date, a sentencing date, but families live with birthdays, anniversaries, and personal moments that may never appear in any official chronology. Those private calendars are often the truest calendars of loss. They are the ones that continue after the cameras leave, after the judgment is published, after the sentence is handed down, and after the public story becomes something people refer to as solved. The word solved, then, must always be spoken carefully. It is true in relation to Jane and Ciara's murders, in the legal sense that Edwards was convicted and sentenced for them, and it is not true in the same way for Sarah, whose case remains unresolved by the court, and whose location remains unknown. Holding that distinction is a form of respect. It keeps the narrative from becoming smoother than the truth, and it honors the different positions in which the families were left after the trial. The long investigation did not produce a perfect ending, but it did produce accountability where accountability could be proved, and that is not a small thing. Accountability after 2 decades means that the early evidence was not wasted, the preserved traces were not silent forever, and the repeated work of many people eventually reached a public answer. It means that Jane and Ciara's names were not left only in memorial and speculation, but entered a judgment where responsibility was assigned after detailed scrutiny. It means, too, that Sarah's name remains part of an ongoing duty, because the absence at the beginning of the case was never merely a prelude to the later convictions. Her absence is its own unresolved truth. And so the story continues in a quieter register, not because there is nothing left to say, but because what remains to be said asks for humility rather than emphasis. There may still be people who remember something. There may still be records that one day assist, There may still be a place unknown to the public and perhaps known only through some forgotten detail where Ciara can finally be brought home. Until then, the file remains partly open and the patience that solved so much must continue in the space it has not yet solved. This is one of the most tender aspects of old cases, that patience does not always end when a verdict is reached, because there may be another question still waiting in the margin. The detectives who worked Claremont across the years would have known that a case can change shape without disappearing. It can move from urgent search to major investigation, from major investigation to cold case, from cold case to renewed forensic focus, from renewed focus to trial, and still retain a portion of mystery at the end. Each stage has its own language. The urgent search asks where someone is. The major investigation asks who was responsible. The cold case asks what was missed, what has changed, and what can now be understood. The trial asks what can be proved. And after the trial, the remaining question asks for endurance, not in the bright public sense, but in the quieter sense of not letting the unresolved part slip away because another part has received its answer. You can imagine the file after sentencing, not closed with a hard final stamp, but divided, with some pages settled into the public record and others still marked by the need for information. That image is perhaps closer to the truth than any clean ending. A case can be both solved and unsolved, both answered and waiting, both a testament to forensic success and a reminder of evidence that never arrived. The Claremont case holds all of that, and it asks anyone who retells it to move slowly enough for every part to remain visible. To remain visible, a case needs more than memory, because memory alone can soften and blur, while a record, however imperfect, gives the past a place to rest until someone is ready to look again with care. The Claremont investigation survived because its record was large, detailed, and preserved across changes in people and method, allowing later investigators to step back into the work without beginning from nothing. They could read the early interviews, follow the decisions made by earlier teams, and see where suspicion had gathered, where it had weakened, and where evidence had remained quietly unresolved. This is not glamorous labor, but it is the labor that lets an old case breathe, because without continuity, even the most important facts can scatter into recollection and rumor. A file is not a living thing, yet in cold case work, it has a kind of pulse, carried by the people who open it, add to it, and refuse to let its questions become merely historical. In the Claremont case, that pulse had to continue through periods when the public heard very little, when no new arrest had been made, and when families could only wait while the machinery of review turned slowly in the background. Those quiet years can be difficult to imagine from the outside, because a public audience often measures a case by announcements, while the work itself may be continuing in forms too small and technical to announce. A scientist may spend days on a comparison that produces only a cautious note. An investigator may confirm that a possible connection is unlikely, and a team may review evidence simply to decide what should be tested next. None of that makes a simple headline, and yet each step can matter, because the pathway to a late solution is often built from decisions that seem modest when they are made. If you picture a cold case unit at work, it may help to picture not a single revelation, but a slow sorting of old materials beneath steady light, with documents laid flat, exhibits checked, and timelines redrawn until some older assumption begins to loosen. The loosening is important, because an old file can contain not only evidence, but the history of how people once understood that evidence. And sometimes the earlier understanding has to be gently set aside. This does not mean earlier detectives failed to care. It means that caring continues by allowing new information to change the shape of the old work, and by accepting that truth is sometimes reached through revision rather than through certainty, held from the beginning. In Claremont, the revision was not one clean turn, but many gradual adjustments, and those adjustments eventually made room for Edwards to become visible within a record that had once seemed to point elsewhere. Visibility in an investigation is not the same as guilt, and the distinction matters because once a name appears, the work becomes even more careful rather than less. Investigators had to ask what connected him to known places, what connected him to vehicles, what connected him to earlier offenses, what connected him to forensic traces. and what could be proved independently rather than assumed. That last word, independently, is one of the quiet anchors of the case, because a strong prosecution does not simply gather similar-looking details. It asks whether those details support one another from different directions. A vehicle record is one direction, a fiber comparison is another, a DNA result is another, and an earlier offense, if admitted for proper purposes, is another still. When those directions begin to converge, the investigation gains shape. But even then, the shape must be tested, because convergence can be powerful only when the underlying points are sound. The long trial became the place where that soundness was examined. The courtroom did not live in the same atmosphere as the streets of Claremont in the 1990s, yet through testimony and evidence, those streets were patiently reconstructed in language. Witnesses were asked to return to nights long past, experts were asked to explain small traces in careful terms, and lawyers moved through the evidence with the slow persistence required by a case that had waited so long. For a listener drifting at the edge of sleep, the courtroom may seem distant, almost like another quiet room in the same old house, where the file is read aloud page by page, and no one is allowed to hurry the ending. That is an appropriate image, because the trial was not a race toward the verdict everyone expected. It was a formal inquiry into what could be found, proven after 2 decades of work. The judge heard the evidence without a jury, which meant the written reasons carried the responsibility of showing how the conclusions had been reached and why the outcome differed from count to count. This is one of the reasons the judgment mattered beyond its immediate result, because it became a map of the reasoning, not just a statement that guilt had or had not been found. A judgment in such a case performs a kind of public housekeeping, placing facts in order, separating strong evidence from weak inference, and making clear where the law has stopped. That stopping point is part of the story. The law stopped before convicting Edwards for Sarah's murder, though it continued through to conviction for Jane and Ciara, and the difference between those positions was not a failure to notice the emotional connection between the 3 cases. It was the result of evidence being different in each case, and of a judge applying the same demanding standard to each charge, even when the public story had long grouped the disappearances together. There is a calm sadness in that distinction, and it should remain calm, because pushing against it with dramatic language would not make the missing evidence appear. Sarah's case remains with the quiet dignity of the unanswered, and every retelling should leave her there not as a footnote, but as the beginning of the public sorrow that followed. The phone call from Claremont, the waiting taxi that did not find her, the searches and appeals and years of uncertainty all remain part of the unresolved record. In the later convictions, the court spoke for Jane and Ciara, but Sarah's absence still speaks in another register, softer and harder at the same time, because it cannot be cross-examined into clarity. Absence has no exhibit number that can explain it fully. It has places searched, times recorded, calls taken, theories considered, and hopes repeatedly renewed, but it also has a silence at its center that no amount of careful retelling should pretend to fill. This is why the Claremont case is so suited to patient reflection, because it resists the neatness that many stories impose, and it asks us to remain faithful to both the known and the unknown. To remain faithful to the known is to acknowledge the work that solved Jane and Ciara's murders, work that involved detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, witnesses, and a court willing to sit with complexity. To remain faithful to the unknown is to acknowledge that Sarah has not been found, and that her family's waiting continues in a different form from the public's memory. The 2 forms of faithfulness do not conflict. They simply sit beside each other, like 2 folders on the same desk, one containing pages that led to conviction, the other still holding space for an answer that may yet come. Sometimes, in old investigations, the unanswered folder can feel almost fragile, because public attention naturally drifts after a major conviction, and people may assume the whole matter has been settled. But careful memory resists that drift. It says that a verdict can be profound without being complete, and that the oldest missing question deserves attention even after the newer legal questions have been answered. The Claremont case therefore becomes not only a story of forensic success, but also a reminder that solving is not always the same as healing, and healing is not always the same as knowing everything. A court can name guilt, and a sentence can mark the seriousness of responsibility, but the families must still carry what no court can carry for them. They carry the private knowledge of who Sarah, Jane, and Ciara were before the case, and the private aftermath of every public development that strangers may discuss for a day and then leave behind. This gap between public and private memory is worth noticing gently because it exists in almost every well-known case, and it shapes the way such stories should be told. For the public, Claremont may be a landmark investigation, a forensic breakthrough, and a chapter in Western Australian legal history. For families, it is not a chapter. It is life divided, altered, and carried forward with love that has had to learn how to live beside absence. No sentence in a narration can fully meet that kind of experience, but it can at least avoid making it smaller. It can speak plainly, avoid spectacle, and allow the investigation's patience to be understood as a response to human worth rather than as a fascination with mystery. Mystery, after all, is not valuable because it entertains. In a real case, mystery is the shape of not knowing, and not knowing is a burden placed most heavily on those closest to the loss. The patient detective work matters because it tries to lift some of that burden, however late and however partially. In Claremont, that lifting took a very long time. It took years when the case was constantly present, years when it seemed to have quieted, years when old evidence was still waiting, and years when forensic science advanced in ways that could be brought back to the file. Those advances are often spoken of broadly, but the practical meaning is simple. Smaller samples could be tested, older traces could be compared more effectively, and databases or methods could reveal connections that earlier tools could not. Yet, technology did not solve the case by itself. It needed the evidence to have been collected, the samples to have been stored, the records to have been maintained, and investigators to understand which questions to ask when the tools improved. Technology is a lamp, not a hand. Someone still has to carry it into the room, decide where to shine it, and interpret what appears when the light reaches the shelves. In the Claremont case, that lamp eventually illuminated the links to Edwards, and from there the investigation could move with renewed focus through material that had long been part of the record. A renewed focus can be powerful, but it also carries responsibility, because once a person is suspected, investigators must guard against seeing only what confirms the suspicion. The proper work is broader than that. It asks what supports the suspicion, what weakens it, what alternative explanations remain, and whether the evidence as a whole can survive the scrutiny of a fair trial. This is why the final case was not merely a police conclusion, but a legal one. Police brought the matter forward, prosecutors presented it, the defense challenged it, and the judge decided it according to law, after hearing an extraordinary amount of evidence. That sequence may sound formal, but formality has a purpose, especially in cases where grief and public concern are intense. It slows the process down. It makes room for challenge. It prevents the emotional force of a case from becoming the same thing as proof. This slow, formal care is not separate from compassion, though it may seem that way to people who want swift answers. It is one of the ways compassion is protected from error. An incorrect answer would not honor Sarah, Jane, or Ciara. A weak answer would not serve their families. Only an answer strong enough to stand in court could carry the weight of a case that had waited more than 20 years. For Jane and Ciara, the court found such an answer, and the convictions became a public recognition of what had happened to them and who was responsible. For Sarah, the answer remained incomplete, and that incompletion should not be treated as an embarrassing loose end, because it is part of the truth. Old cases often teach this, if we let them. They teach that reality is not arranged for narrative satisfaction, and that even the most diligent work can leave a question standing in the doorway. The doorway remains. And perhaps, in the quietest part of the night, that is where the story asks us to pause. Not with fear, not with frustration, but with a respectful awareness that some families continue to live beside an open threshold. The idea of a threshold appears often in the Claremont case, even if not in the official language, because so much happened at boundaries, between night and morning, between public places and private journeys, between active investigation and cold case review, between suspicion and proof. There was the threshold of a taxi ride that was requested and never completed, the threshold of a hotel entrance caught in memory and surveillance, the threshold of a courtroom where old evidence became present testimony. And there was the threshold of science, where methods that once could not answer certain questions eventually became capable of revealing what had been present all along. Thresholds are quiet places in the story, neither fully one room nor another, and the Claremont case spent many years on them. It was not forgotten, but it was not solved. It was not without evidence, but the evidence had not yet joined into proof. It was not without suspects, but the right shape had not yet become clear. In time, the case crossed some of those thresholds, and crossing them required patience from people who had no guarantee that patience would be rewarded. This is one of the humble truths of long investigations. People continue even when the outcome is not promised. They continue because the alternative is to let silence harden, and because a society that stops asking old questions too easily becomes a poorer place for the vulnerable and the lost. The Claremont investigation asked its old question for more than 2 decades, and eventually the answer emerged, not whole, but strong enough to convict Edwards for Jane and Ciara. That answer changed the public record. It changed the way the earlier evidence was understood. It changed the standing of old suspicions, and it changed the story that Perth had carried since the 1990s. But it did not change everything. Sarah was still missing, and Jane and Ciara were still gone, and families still had to wake the next morning in a world where verdicts had spoken but love continued to grieve. The morning after an answer can be strangely quiet. There may be relief, exhaustion, sorrow, and perhaps a small settling of something that had been held too tightly for too long, but there is no simple return to before. There is only after, and after has its own patience. The families would know that better than anyone because they had lived through the before. The disappearance, the search, the long investigation, the arrest, the trial, and the sentencing, each stage arriving with its own demands. Public attention rises at certain moments, then falls away, while the private life of the case continues with a steadier and more demanding rhythm. That rhythm is not visible from the outside, but it is real. It is in the way names are spoken at family gatherings, in the way anniversaries arrive, in the way a court's findings become part of memory without replacing memory itself. For those who work the case, after may have meant files archived differently, lessons studied, evidence retained, and the continuing obligation to pursue Sarah's unresolved question where possible. For the wider community, after may have meant a changed relationship with a story that had once seemed permanently unanswered. And for anyone who approaches the case now, years later, after the judgment and sentence, after the public explanation of fibers and DNA in vehicles, there remains the responsibility to approach it slowly. Slowly is the right word. Not because the facts are faint, but because the people are real, and because a gentle pace allows dignity to remain present where a faster telling might turn everything into momentum. A fast telling would move quickly from disappearance to arrest, from evidence to verdict, from sadness to closure, but the actual case did not move quickly, and its meaning would be distorted. It unfolded across more than 20 years. It passed through thousands of hours of work. It depended on small traces that had to wait in silence until they could be read. And so the telling should also take its time, not to prolong sorrow, but to honor the nature of the investigation itself. There is a connection between form and truth here, because a rushed story about a patient case becomes untrue in its rhythm, even if its facts are accurate. The Claremont case was not a sudden chase. It was a long return. It was the turning of pages, the rechecking of samples, the revisiting of witness accounts, the letting go of old suspicions, and the careful acceptance of new evidence when it finally grew strong enough. It was also a reminder that science and humanity are not opposites in an investigation. The microscope and the family appeal, the fiber report and the remembered laugh, the DNA profile and the name spoken in grief all belong to the same wider effort to answer for a human life. Without the humanity, the science would have no moral purpose. Without the science, the humanity might remain unable to prove what it needed to prove. In Claremont, the two met across time, and their meeting produced the convictions that had seemed so distant for so long. That meeting did not happen in one room or one year. It happened across storage facilities, laboratories, interview rooms, offices, streets, courts, and the private homes of families who continued to wait while the official world moved at its slow pace. The geography of the case is therefore wider than any map can show. It includes Claremont's streets, but also the places where evidence was held, the places where scientists worked, the places where detectives gathered their thoughts, and the places where families carried hope through ordinary days. A map can mark Sterling Highway, Bayview Terrace, and the routes leading away from the suburb, but it cannot mark the internal distances traveled by those who waited. Those distances are known only inwardly. Still, the map matters, because cases need geography as well as memory, and the streets provide the fixed frame against which testimony and timing can be understood. The last known places, the likely routes, the vehicle sightings, the locations where Jane and Ciara were found, all formed part of the spatial thinking investigators had to do. Space and time meet in a case like this. A person is seen at one place at one time, a car may be remembered at another place soon after, a call is logged, a journey is inferred, and investigators ask what could realistically have happened within the minutes available. Those questions are careful and practical, and they help protect the inquiry from drifting into pure speculation. They also show how ordinary urban details can become important because traffic lights, road layouts, phone boxes, taxi ranks, and parking places all shape what is possible. The world itself becomes part of the file, not because it changes into something unnatural, but because the investigation has to understand how ordinary life was arranged on the nights that mattered. In 1996 and 1997, Claremont at night had its own habits, its own flow of people leaving venues, gathering near roads, searching for taxis, or moving toward the train. Those habits created both witnesses and uncertainty, because many people were present, but few were watching with the knowledge that they were seeing something that might one day matter. That is one of the persistent sorrows of witness evidence. The mind records ordinary moments lightly, and only later does the world ask it to retrieve them with precision. Some people can retrieve a detail clearly, while others can retrieve only a feeling, and investigators must treat both with caution. A feeling may be sincere but not enough. A detail may be accurate but incomplete. And in the space between sincerity and proof, the investigation has to keep moving, patiently, respectfully, without turning memory into more than it can bear. The final convictions did not rest on memory alone, which is one reason they could arrive after so much time had passed. They rested on the convergence of memory with record, trace, science, and legal reasoning. This convergence is the heart of the solved part of Claremont, and it is worth dwelling on gently, because it shows how different forms of knowledge can support one another when each is allowed to remain in its proper place. A witness gives a remembered observation. A record gives a dated or documented fact. A fiber gives a physical association. A DNA profile gives a biological connection. A judgment gives a reasoned conclusion about whether the evidence as a whole reaches the required standard. No one form replaces the others. Instead, each contributes what it can, and the patient investigator learns to hear the difference between them. That listening across forms of evidence is one of the quiet arts of detective work, and in a cold case it becomes even more important because the years have made some forms weaker while leaving others unexpectedly strong. Memory may weaken. Paper may survive. Trace evidence may remain. If preserved, technology may improve, and a person who once seemed invisible may eventually appear at the intersection of these surviving things. This is what happened with Edwards. He appeared not because the past suddenly changed, but because the surviving pieces of the past were finally read together in a way that made his role visible. The word finally carries much of the case's weight. Finally, but not easily. Finally, but not completely. Finally, after families had waited through seasons and years, and after investigators had learned that persistence itself must be organized, disciplined, and renewed. The arrest in December of 2016 was therefore both an event and a culmination, a day that became possible because many earlier days had not been abandoned. A person seeing only that day might imagine the case changed in an instant, but the instant had been prepared for years. Behind it were old exhibits, old statements, old offenses, new tests, fresh analysis, and the slow courage of revising what people thought they knew. The courage of revision is a quiet theme in this case because investigators had to move from uncertainty through suspicion toward proof, without allowing old errors or public pressure to decide the outcome. Every long investigation has its own history of mistakes or blind alleys, and to pretend otherwise would make detective work sound cleaner than it is. The important thing is not that every early path was correct. The important thing is that the case remained open enough for correction, and that later evidence was allowed to lead the inquiry toward the person who was eventually convicted. In that sense, the solution was not only forensic, but institutional. It required a police force capable of keeping a difficult case alive, laboratories capable of revisiting old material, and a court capable of weighing a vast body of evidence without being hurried by the years already spent. It also required public endurance because cases that stay in public memory can continue to draw information, support, and scrutiny, all of which can matter when handled responsibly. Scrutiny matters too. It asks whether police methods were fair, whether evidence was properly handled, whether earlier suspects were treated justly, and whether the final case was strong enough to justify conviction. These questions may feel uncomfortable, but they are part of the same commitment to truth that makes a cold case worth solving. A wrongful suspicion can damage an innocent life. A mishandled exhibit can damage a prosecution. An unsupported theory can damage public trust. So patience has an ethical dimension, not just an investigative one, because it gives truth the time and discipline it needs to separate itself from urgency. The Claremont case, after so many years, shows that ethical patience at work in both its success and its limits. It succeeded in convicting Edwards for Jane and Ciara. It stopped short of convicting him for Sarah, and it left behind a public record that is more honest because it does not pretend those outcomes are the same. As the narration moves on, softly and without haste, that honesty becomes the thread to follow. Not certainty where none exists, not drama where grief is enough, not a smooth ending where the truth remains uneven. Only the quiet recognition that after more than 20 years, patient work brought part of the long darkness into view, and where it could not bring light, it left a marker for those who may one day continue.